So the systematic cultivation of these cities would be analogous to the development of scientific instrumentation. And that's something that we need to begin working on. We need to have schools for the cultivation of siddhi. And we need to be able to find ways of figuring out whether someone's got a siddhi that's working or not, whether they're deluding themselves or not, right? These are very important questions that we have to begin to work on. We also have to begin, and this is extremely important for all of us, we have to begin working on cultivating continuity of consciousness. Because as it is right now, when we fall asleep, it's as if we cross the river Lethe, right? We cross the river of forgetfulness. We forget that we were ever awake. I mean, what's a lucid dream? A lucid dream is a dream in which we remember that we were awake before the dream and anticipate that we'll be awake again after the dream. But usually, when we're in a dream, it's as if we've always been there. We have forgotten our past. We don't anticipate our future. We need to develop continuity of consciousness. As Sri Aurobindo says, we need to learn to go to sleep without falling asleep. We need to bring our mental awareness with us as we cross the transition between waking and dreaming, or between life and death, which is the same river that we cross. We need to get better coins with which to pay Sharon, right? So he'll let us stay awake. There are various ways that we can do this. One is by developing lucidity in waking life. Because in fact, most of us dream through most of our lives. We just follow along, right? But we all know what it's like to be awake when we're awake. We all know what it's like to be thinking about what's happening, to be evaluating the possibilities and making intelligent decisions. Right? We need to cultivate that in waking life, because that way, when we're dreaming, we'll be able to bring that with us. Right? People who are not lucid in waking life are unlikely to be able to cultivate lucidity in their dream life. Right? So the cultivation of lucidity is important in any case. But there's also a whole host of methods for not so much cultivating direct continuity of consciousness as for triggering consciousness on the other side. I used to be a headhunter, and I was placing electronics engineers, taking them out of one company and putting them in another. And one of the guys that I placed, I had lunch with him, and it turned out that he was an active lucid dreamer, that he had lucid dreams all the time. And I asked him, well, how do you do it? He said, well, here's what I did. He said, I cultivated the habit of drawing. So he'd go outside, he'd see something like a tree or a lamppost, and then he would come home and he would draw it. And so he began to train himself to observe in a certain way. He'd look at something like he was going to draw it. And then when he was dreaming, that began to happen to him spontaneously. In his dreams, he would look at things that way, and then he would wake up in the dream. So he trained himself to trigger lucidity on the other side. Right? So there's a whole host of techniques that work that way. There's also techniques for encouraging continuity of memory. So there's a guy, Robert Bruce, who writes about out-of-body travel. Really interesting guy. And he says that we're all having really interesting out-of-body experiences all the time. But the problem is that when we come back into our body, the memory of what happens out of our body gets sort of overlaid and lost because our brains aren't accustomed to storing it. And so he tells people, when you're out of your body and you're about to come back into your body, you should shout, "I will remember," as you enter back into your physical body. I haven't tried these things, right? But it sounds like they work. So there are all kinds of techniques that we can begin to develop, and I'm sure people here know techniques that I don't. Also, the cultivation of concentration. The cultivation of concentration is the core of the development of any yogic practice. I was reading yesterday in Sri Aurobindo in the Synthesis of Yoga, he said, by cultivating concentration, we can come to know anything we want to know, because knowledge comes by concentrating on the thing we want to know. And he says also through concentration, we can have anything we want to have. If we concentrate on it with enough fixity, we'll get it. And also through concentration, we can become whatever we want to become, including becoming the divine. Right? So concentration is key. So the cultivation of concentration, the cultivation of continuity of memory, also what the Vedic people call pratyahara, or the faculty of withdrawing our attention from the senses, so that instead of being outwardly directed into the waking world, we can withdraw our attention, bring it into the transphysical worlds, operate there, and hopefully bring back memories of what we have seen there. So this is a vast subject. I'm just like waving my hands at it. But the basic point is that I don't think we will have an adequate science of the transphysical worlds until we're able to operate lucidly in those worlds with continuity of memory. That's the key. Right? And exactly how to do that is not clear to me, but I think we need to be developing institutions that will help us to do that, developing institutions and ways of life that will encourage the kind of consciousness that is able to take in and process the larger reality that we will be experiencing as we go through this mutation of consciousness. So the first one then is developing psychological modes of explanation, taking them seriously, and working to clarify the logic of psychological explanation or mythic explanation. And the second method I'm suggesting is this yogic method of developing the faculties that we need to really clearly apprehend what's going on, and communities of adequate investigators who can check each other's work, which is also a very important part of science. And then the third way is a little more speculative, but it has to do with developing a more logical understanding of the transphysical worlds themselves. So if we look at our physical science, I'd like to suggest that physical science is all about the spatio-temporal patterns of causal transmission. Right? The way in which causes are transmitted through time and space. Right? So take Newton's gravitational law, which says that all bodies attract each other with a force that's proportional to their mass and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. So the heavier the thing is, the more it attracts, but the further away the thing it's attracting, the less strong the gravitational pull is, okay? This is a law about how the causal effect, which is the gravitational effect, operates across time and space. All of our physical laws come down to that, I would suggest. They have to do with how causes propagate through space-time. That's what science is all about. We have nothing like that for the transphysical worlds. Why? Because we don't understand the logic of transphysical space-time. I've been talking about this in terms of distance. How far apart are things in space, in transphysical space-time? If Julianne is doing a remote healing, she is in immediate proximity to the person that she's working on, even if that person is physically across the globe, because there are different definitions of distance that are involved. And yet, if Julianne's doing a distant healing, it's a causal transmission, either by means of aim or by direct, efficient causation between actual occasions of higher grade. Right? That's a direct causal transmission in time and space, but not the time and space of the waking world, which is completely dominated by the metrical geometry of the inorganic. If we can begin to formulate for ourselves the laws of distance in the transphysical worlds, and then we can begin to identify or categorize the types of causal interactions, we can begin to create a science which is roughly analogous to physical science, but that will apply itself to the transphysical worlds. I'm sure that this new science, this particular kind of science, will not give the kind of predictive results we get from our current science, because transphysical entities are inherently less predictable and more free. And yet, it could give us some very important insights into what's going on in the transphysical worlds. So I'm very interested in this particular mode of approach, and what it requires is that we examine what happens in transphysical worlds with a mathematical imagination. What is the geometry of the space-time in the transphysical worlds? I have an idea. People have spoken about this in terms of higher dimensions, like the fourth dimension is transphysical. I don't think that makes any sense, because no matter how many dimensions we get, if they're at right angles to each other, we're still dealing in essentially metrical space. We're still dealing with physical matter. But it may be that what goes on in these transphysical worlds can be comprehended in terms of what's called meta-geometry. Right? There was a huge breakthrough that took place in the 1700s where people began to realize that Euclidean geometry is not the only geometry there is, that there are other collections of postulates which also make coherent geometries. And the way this came about is interesting. It's that in Euclid there are several different basic axioms, and one of them is that parallel lines never meet. And for some reason, people were never comfortable with that axiom. All the other axioms seemed fine, but that one just seemed like it ought to be provable in terms of the others. And nobody could ever do it. And so the discomfort with this axiom went on for several thousand years. People kept struggling with this. And finally, in the 1700s, somebody came up with the bright idea that they would assume it was false and derive a contradiction. So someone said, okay, let's assume that all parallel lines meet twice. And they began trying to work out a geometry based on that, looking for a contradiction. And they couldn't find one. Right? And so they began to realize that there are these other geometries. And then some brilliant person came along and said, oh, look, on the surface of a sphere, all parallel lines meet twice. All the great circles meet twice, right? And so they realized that this geometry, I think it's Riemannian geometry, is the geometry of spherical surfaces. But that the whole three-dimensional world might be a huge hypersphere, and we wouldn't know the difference.